The 40th anniversary of the publication of Visual Pleasure Narrative Cinema has brought me, like everybody else on the panel, back to reading it recently. And I think last week or the week before, I was asked by Sight and Sound to write how I came to write the Visual Pleasure Narrative Cinema essay. So I had to reread it for that, and I reread it for this panel. And I'd like to echo a number of the people who've just spoken who said that it still contains some surprises. I hadn't read it for quite some time, and there were a number of things that struck me. So what I thought I would do was go back a bit into the past and into the context of writing it. And what I did was make a number of points that are both free associations, but also, I hope, revealing of the time in which the essay was made. First of all, the essay seems to me so grounded in its time. It couldn't have been written before the women's liberation movement of the early 1970s, which changed my relationship to Hollywood cinema. It couldn't have been written after I became involved with film studies in the early 80s, and I wouldn't then have been able to think in such sweeping and polemical ways that brought Mandy to call it, and Joanna to call it, a manifesto, or even perhaps to have written it with such particular pleasure and feeling. Because precisely as, was it Emma who pointed out, or Joanna, that I hadn't written. I'd been in a state of resistance since I left university with my scraped third, and hadn't written. So I was discovering the process of writing very much through the women's liberation movement and the reading group I was in at the time, which was called the History Group, which I've described the process in the Sight and Sound essay, and it's also in the second introduction to Visual and Other Pleasures, so I won't go into it now. But it was that introduced me to Freud, and reading Freud and thinking Freud from a feminist perspective. So it was of enormous importance. And it's also being revived in an online discussion for Tate Modern with the artist Mary Kelly, who will be over in a couple of weeks. So this is just to do a bit of publicity, because I think you're going to be involved with that as well. Yeah. What I found, one of the things I found strange thinking back was that the period that gave rise to the essay was in many ways very strongly marked by its own political moment, which Mandy was evoking. But also, that time is characterized by a certain, what I think of as an in-betweenness. And that's one of the things I want to talk about. It was in between in my own life, in that it was my beginning to start to write within the context of feminism. I still refuse to use the first person singular, partly out of a kind of shudder at self-expressiveness, but also out of the ideology of feminism, which emphasized the we and the us over the individual. But a point which I think has been made recently, it was also the era of the death of the author. And so all these things, as Isaac pointed out, there's so many different lines and threads connecting and interweaving at that point. But also, the essay was an experiment in writing, and in that sense, as I think as Isaac pointed out, belongs to that period of experimental filmmaking. And I think even Screen, if one may say so, was an experimental journal. It didn't come out of academia. It was introducing high theory, but it was introducing it, in a sense, without much of an introduction. The whole thing was a bit of a slap in the face for high British culture or high Englishness that I think French theory represented alongside the interest in American popular culture at the time, both of which were pretty anathema to traditional Englishness. So I think that that experimental era was enormously important. The presence of the Edinburgh Film Festival, symposia organised by the BFI Education Department, the films and the extraordinary utopian, a kind of blind utopianism that led us to think that we might be able to change the world. We were quite soon disabused by our first woman prime minister. Yeah. So I've been a bit uneasy about the essay's insertion into an academic context, but I feel that this event and the presentations that we've heard bears witness not only to the essay's survival, but also to the revived interest in 1970s experimental culture, the season that's going on now, the screening of Penthesilea this evening, my friends Sue Clayton and I we are putting together a collection of essays written by a younger generation of writers about that period. And the next point I wanted to make was that partly because it was polemical, partly because it was a manifesto, it seemed to me at the time that it would necessarily be ephemeral, so grounded in its moment, so produced by the politics of the time. And I just noticed the opening sentence to my introduction to visual and other pleasures, and I just thought I'd quote that. It says, "I sacrificed well-balanced argument, research, and refinement of style to the immediate interest of the moment, the demands of polemic, the economy of an idea, or the shape and pattern of a line of thought." And I was very touched by, Joanna, your point about the writing. But one of the other investments that I had in the style of the piece was to make it visual, so that it has a pattern in which each section is symmetrical and sets up a kind of pseudo-dialectic in which A and B then produce C. And whether that works or not is, in a sense, not quite the point. The point was that it was an essay that existed on a visual plane as well as on a written plane. Now, all that groundedness, that sense of the moment, gives the essay a kind of documentary, it feels to me like a document of its time. So, in some sense, it's so symptomatic that its accuracy, whether it's right about the male gaze, which, by the way, I only mentioned once, is irrelevant, in a sense, to how it speaks for its moment, for how it speaks as a historical document. But also, it has this strange uncertainty in betweenness again of being poised between a political moment, the beginning of the women's liberation movement, the aesthetic context that you two were both mentioning, and the academic context in which it was finally integrated, in which a number of you have mentioned encountering it. Because it was extremely important that the series of politics representation, image, academic, exists as a kind of chain, so that the essay emerges from the women's liberation movement's insistence that there was a politics of the body, a politics of the female body, just as later on there was a politics of the gay, lesbian body. So in a sense, this was a pioneering moment of making that insistence on the politics of the body. But as soon as you had a politics of the body, you went on to a politics of the representation of the body. And so away from the campaigns about abortion, contraception, controlling sexualities, which came under what one might call the discourses of the legal and the medical, one then went on to the question of the language of images, and which demanded necessarily a certain theorization. So theory was actually literally a political weapon. It was moving, as I think I say in the introduction, from a fascination with the films that I was writing about to a fascination that was displaced into the mechanics of fascination. And so how do you analyze fascination? How do you analyze those kind of questions of investment in images that you've all talked about? And so the direction shifted from the woman as spectacle, naturalized in popular culture, to the patriarchal psyche that had constructed that spectacle. And that, I think, demanded that semiotic psychoanalytic thing. I often like to think about it, as Orson Welles said, as dollar book Freud, rather than actual Freud, because it was a political weapon. And I did use Lacan, and I was surprised. I thought, I'd kept saying there's no Lacan in that essay, but actually there is. And although I felt that life was too short really to get to grips with Lacan, he did leave his traces in those early encounters, and he did indeed actually have an influence on me. So it was also in between the old days of cinephilia, the excitement of new waves, new cinemas, especially avant-gardes. And I do mention the avant-garde, and I was glad how much it was there, but sad also at the mention of 16mm, and again the sense that 16mm would transform filmmaking, whereas actually it was comparatively short-lived, although that was how we first met. It was in the 16mm context. But there's also, I think, a sense, again, of playing down self-expressivity, citing the characteristics of counter-cinema negative aesthetics that related to my work with Peter Warren and the films of the period. And I had thought of talking a little bit about the films, but they've been mentioned, and I won't necessarily go into them now. Now, I wanted to make a few really final points, and because I thought I'd be running out of time, I've almost listed them. First, that the essay, in a strange way, seeing that I never used the first person singular, was actually autobiographical, in the sense that it did literally describe my way of watching films when I was absorbed in the Hollywood cinema of the studio system. Because during the 60s, instead of watching the new American cinema, I really watched the kind of Hollywood cinema that was made in the 50s, 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I watched the films with a male mode of address. I mean, I felt I was being addressed by the films with a masculine discourse, which came out, actually, of the cinema itself that was being used. And so what happened to me in the aftermath of the encounter with the women's movement was that suddenly I was jolted out of that way of looking and found that I was detached from the screen, detached from the story, and that blissful sense of loss of self into the world of the cinema, and suddenly became a woman looking at films which I'd loved and now began to irritate me. And this, I think, is that sense of that lost, invisible look. And of course, a number of black and gay theorists, as Isaac has pointed out, have also talked about that jolt out of the attentive viewing into the critical viewing. I also wanted to say that I've gone back to that old cinema. I've gone back to writing about Hitchcock, and have also had to acknowledge how much I learnt to be critical of this cinema from Hitchcock himself. I felt he was teaching me in some sense. I mean, this is rather in the same argument of the women who knew too much.
Yeah. Tanya Midleski.
Exactly, who sees this ambivalence in Hitchcock.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to point out that when I reread the essays, I realized that my approaches to both Hitchcock and Sternberg were more complex than I'd remembered, and that in the section on Hitchcock, I argue that the male look shifts from the side of the law into a sexually compromised voyeurism, which then boomerangs both on the male protagonist and on the spectator in the cinema itself. Sternberg, I feel I've given rather short shrift to, and I think he's had short shrift over the years, in that people take up the Hitchcock side and forget that actually my argument about Sternberg is really for a cinematic fusion between woman and spectacle, a screen and spectacle, that it's a cinema of photogenie, and as well as a break with the active look of the male protagonist. And I was struck, rereading the essays, that I talk about the moment when Amy Jolie in Morocco kicks off her gold sandals. This was a black and white film. How on earth could I have guessed that they were gold sandals? Yeah. So two final points, really. I was also interested in arguing that Hollywood had its own specificity. That although the essay is obviously critical of what's called mainstream cinema and so on, it was also implicitly arguing against the kind of anthology archive position that only the avant-garde could have a cinematic specificity, and that actually Hollywood did have its own, even if only found in the organization of looks around gender and the spectacle of the female star. And I say that look defines the cinema, the possibility of exposing it and varying it, and also thus separating it from other forms of female spectacles such as striptease, pin-up, and so on. It was very important that there was a specificity to the way that the look was modified and absorbed. Now, you've all said very touchingly and wonderfully that the essay still lives now, but going back to its groundedness in the 70s, its status, to my mind, as documentation of its time, it also seems to me that it's necessarily been rendered archaic by changes in technology, that no longer do we normally sit in a wonderful cinema like this and become absorbed in darkness in the screen. And by the turn of the century, I found myself compelled to write Death 24 Times a Second Movement and the Stillness Image, Stillness, whatever it is, and to point out that many, many different ways of looking at films, many different kinds of spectator had been liberated out of the digital, even if at the same time we'd lost that attentiveness. And I think it's now that there's multiplicity of spectators who, in a sense, were homogenized until they rebelled in the old days, can now, as it were, find their own engagement, their own kinds of perverse or not so perverse pleasures in manipulating the original film and finding in it, in them, things that might not have been noticeable at the time, almost like secret time bombs of different kinds of eroticisms and different kinds of pleasures that had to be suppressed at the moment, but can finally find their place in our new cinema. I do agree with you, though, that the question of the woman as spectacle and even the male as spectacle in our increasingly commodified society is still an issue. And if the essay then helps with still continuing to think about that, that's all to the good. I also just wanted to end with a couple of other thanks. I wanted to thank Georgina Bourne for organizing the 30 years of Visual Pleasure. I wanted to thank Ben Brewster, who was the editor of Screen at the time, who was a brilliant editor, and I think he came up with the title. Also, Peter Wallen, who was very important in discussions about the essay. And then I wanted to mention that Emma Hedich and Ruth Novacek helped me make a visual essay of visual pleasure and narrative cinema, which we've never done anything very much with. I'd wanted to show some of it today, but couldn't figure out how to do it. But I'm going to try and kind of get it out into the world so that people can see it. And I also wanted to thank everybody who's ever commented on the essay. I've often felt pretty bad that I've never ever responded to all the debates and discussion, the comments, whether favorable or adverse, over the years, because I couldn't quite take it on. I felt the essay had to float free and become something of its own. And I had to kind of let it go as it took on the strange status of an iconic object. But here I am.